Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Today, I am so excited to speak with Mary Gentile. Mary is the creator of Giving Voice to Values, which is an approach to values-driven leadership development in business education and in the workplace. Instead of looking at ethical analysis, which Mary will explain to us in a lot more detail, the GVV curriculum focuses on ethical implementation and asks key questions. In terms of who Mary is, she's one of those guests who in a lot of ways probably needs no introduction. She has been named one of Compliance Week's top minds. That was in 2017. She is one of the 100 most influential in business ethics by Ethisphere in 2015. That's always a mouthful. One of the top thought leaders in trust, 2015 Lifetime Achievement Award winner by Trust Across America and Trust Across the World. And her voice, Giving Voice to Values, How to Speak Your Mind When You Know What's Right, and her curriculum is known globally. She is the professor of practice at University of Virginia Darden School of Business, a senior advisor at Aspen Institute Business and Society Program, and she's a consultant. There are just so many more accolades. It's too hard to list, but her experience and the GVV program have been something really illuminating for me. I'm someone who believes that people really want to be ethical and to do the right thing. And by learning more about GVV, I've gotten some new ideas and some tools. And now with that, thank you so much for being here. And can you just talk a little bit about your background and how you initially got involved with the ethics and leadership movement?
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation, Lisa. And I'm happy to do so. So, I actually started my professional career related to business and business education and corporate training a number of years ago, back in the I guess it was the mid 80s, when I went to work at Harvard Business School. And I started there as a case writer, and then I ran and managed their entire case writing program. And after a few years, just I guess about 2 years, I remember going to my boss and saying, this has been fun, but I want to do something more meaningful. And so I think I want to leave, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of notice. And she said, well, why do you want to leave? And I said, well, this is great, but I just feel like, I want to use my skills in a way where I feel like I'm making a bigger impact. And she said, oh, okay, you care about that kind of stuff? So she said, well, it happened that around that time, Harvard was starting to develop its first required curriculum around ethics and values. And they said, would you like to get involved with that? So that was kind of the sort of unexpected start to my work in the field of values-driven leadership development and business ethics. I was involved with helping to design and teach in their first required curriculum there. I also designed and taught their first course on managing diversity. But, I left I left Harvard in the mid 90s, and, I went on and spent 5 years at Babson College in Boston. And now I'm based at the University of Virginia, the Darden School of Business. And I have to say that after working in the field of business ethics for a number of years, through that kind of coincidental beginning at HBS, I became pretty discouraged, pretty disillusioned. This was probably the mid to late 90s. I decided to take a step away from this work because it started to feel a bit futile to me. It also sometimes felt a little hypocritical. Because the way we tended to talk about ethics and values, whether it was in an MBA classroom or in a corporate training room, it was usually, we would share some thorny ethical dilemmas, and then we'd get into a discussion about it. And if we were in an academic setting, we'd share some philosophical models of reasoning to help, sort of decide, what about this? What about that? And to think more rigorously and consistently. Or if we were in a corporate setting, we would share the relevant laws and regulations, maybe the company code of conduct, the corporate values. And we would just basically ask people, look at this scenario and decide if this behavior is over the line or not. And so it was approaching ethics and values-driven leadership as if they were entirely cognitive, entirely intellectual challenges. People would always describe it as a decision-making model. And what I was finding is there were a couple problems with that. The first problem was that when you present it that way, there's almost a kind of motivated reasoning that starts to kick in, where people can start defending any position, and it can get into sometimes a sort of schooling for sophistry, is what I call it. People learn to rationalize anything. I had a great experience around that. I was interviewing a CEO, an entrepreneur, and I was talking to him about ethics and values in business, and he said, I want to tell you a story. And he told me the story about interviewing a young man who had recently graduated from one of the top MBA programs in the U.S. And he asked him if he'd taken an ethics course in his graduate training. And the gentleman said, well, yes, it was required. And so the CEO said, well, what did you learn? And this graduate said, well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning from philosophy. And then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, you should select the action that you want to take and, decide what you want to do, and then select a model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do. And so, this was not exactly what the professor was hoping this gentleman would walk away with. And the CEO who was telling me that story was kind of, yanking my chain, right? Because I was the quote unquote ethics lady. But there's a lot of truth to this, that these models of ethical reasoning and this way of approaching ethics as if it's entirely about decision-making can lead to this kind of learning the rationalizations. One faculty member at Harvard called them the professional rationalizations. And so that's kind of one problem with this. The other problem is that I also found that, there were often many students and or business practitioners when I was in organizational settings who, were motivated to do the right thing, but they just didn't think it was possible. So when you approach it as if it's entirely about making a decision, you stop short of actually enabling or empowering people. And so those were the kind of triggers that first led me to be frustrated and despairing, and then later became part of the triggers for developing Giving Voice to Values. So
when you started putting together the GVV, Giving Voice to Values, you were changing this paradigm. You're talking about ethical analysis and ethical action. Can you talk about how you came up with that? You've talked a little bit about the frustration, and then also talk about kind of the questions and the way the thought process that you go through or that you speak about going through.
Sure. Well, so the traditional way that I and others would approach ethics and values in business education and in corporate training was to focus on what I call awareness and analysis. Awareness meaning we're going to share with you all the ways in which you might confront ethical conflicts given the industry you're in or the part of the world you're operating in or the function you perform within the business, whether it's, finance or accounting or operations or HR. So you build awareness, so you're going to recognize these issues when they come up. And then the analysis piece is, as I was describing before, is to, give you some scenarios and say, let's figure out, is this over the line or not? And so you kind of stop short. And so what I was realizing, both from the stories I was sharing a moment ago, and also from a lot of research that I was starting to come across, is that what we really needed to do was to develop a kind of teaching technology for action. The research I started to come across, there were a number of strains of research. Now, this was about 10 or 12 years ago. There's actually more now. We see research in the field of psychology that talks about habit formation. There's another group of scholars who study what's often referred to as positive deviance. That is, they study people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. They have a nice phrase. It's their phrase, not mine. They say, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more effective to ask them to act their way into a different way of thinking. So that was kind of provocative for me. And then I started to see, there's been a lot of attention in recent years to research around cognitive neurosciences. It's become quite popular to look at that research. And I'm sure that your listeners have, read about some of the research around brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways, the idea that we can set new patterns as we grow and learn and develop. But the story I always like to tell comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. The story is that back when I was first at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. And there were a lot of these classes in the Boston area. Perhaps you've taken one at some point. They all teach pretty much the same thing. They teach you the physical moves, so it's fist to bridge of nose and heel to instep and knee to groin. And you practice these moves in the air. You practice ways to get out of particular holds. And then the idea is now if anyone ever attacks me, right, I would know what to do. But there was one class that was different. It was called model mugging. And it was a developmental model. So they'd still teach you all those moves and you'd rehearse them, in the air. But then the idea was at a certain point, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit. And we would all line up and we would take turns getting attacked by this guy. And then you could use these moves on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you just waited your turn to get attacked. But as the weeks went on, week after week, I might be looking to my left, talking to someone, and he would come and grab me, and I would never know when. I would never know what hold he was going to use. And it was pretty nerve-wracking. But they explained to us that this was based on this research called specific state muscle memory. So people who are listening who are athletes will be familiar with this. The idea is that if you rehearse something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you will be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in that moment, your body will remember. It becomes an automatic response. So, the tennis pro will practice her serve over and over so that when she finally goes to tournament and she's there under all that stress, her body will just normally assume the proper form. And this was kind of provocative to me. I remember being in this class and lying on my back on the floor one day because I'd failed to protect myself and this guy had taken me down. And I was looking at the ceiling and I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a kind of default behavior, a default to voice, but not just to speaking up? Because the other work I was doing was to gather stories from many, many, many people at all levels within companies and organizations, about times when they'd faced values conflicts. And I was hearing that when people responded to them effectively, it wasn't usually a matter of, telling off their boss, or shaking their fist and saying that's wrong. It was much more often something that was more tactical, more nuanced, more strategic, something that used all of their communication skills around influence and problem redefinition, that enabled the people they were trying to influence to save face, but also to move the behaviors in a more in a direction that was more consistent with their values. So, I was thinking, could we create a kind of teaching technology, a pedagogical approach for training people for this kind of action so they would create this kind of moral muscle memory. And that was, the impetus for developing GVV. I then had to figure out, well, how do we do that? And I think that's part of what you're asking. And so I created what I call the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment. Back when I was still at Harvard, I used to run their case writing program. And, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the traditional business case study format. They're 10 or 15 pages long. They usually feature a very senior executive or a CEO. And, at the end of the case, the protagonist will lean back in their chair and look out the window and say, what should I do? And then, of course, there's a discussion that follows. And this is a great way to teach awareness and analysis, but it doesn't really teach action. And so I decided to develop a different kind of teaching case or teaching scenario. So the GVV thought experiment cases tend to be much shorter. Sometimes they're only a few paragraphs. They feature people at every level in the organization, because what I was finding through my conversations and my teaching and consulting was that people start experiencing these issues all the time, very early. I mean, people start experiencing values conflicts right away. The degree and the importance of them may vary, but you start encountering them. But the big difference between a GVV style thought experiment case and a traditional case is that the thought experiment ends with a protagonist who's already decided what's right. And the question becomes, how could he or she get it done? And the reason we do that is because I find that if I ask people, here's a scenario, what would you do? You'll get three kinds of answers, and none of them really help us get to this action preparation I'm talking about. You get the people who would say, oh, I would do the right thing. And they may really mean it, but we know from experience that often they don't, for a lot of reasons. And then you'll get the people who say, well, I know what you want me to say, Mary, but in the real world, it's not possible. And they may really mean that. They may just be trying to be honest, or they may be, playing devil's advocate. And then you get the third group who just argue with the premise. They'll just say, well, it's not wrong, or it's not important, or it's not a big deal, or. And so any one of those answers, whether they're sincere or insincere, will stop the conversation before you get to action planning and scripting and rehearsal and building that muscle memory, that habit I was talking about. So instead, like I say, our cases are what we call post-decision making. We have a scenario and the protagonist has decided what's right. And I don't ask you to tell me whether that's what you would do. Instead, I just ask, what if you were this person who thinks this is the right thing to do? How could they be effective? And what that does is it brings the stress down. It brings the emotion down. It helps people think more creatively. You look at the research on innovation and creation, and when you take the pressure down, and you create this kind of safe space or laboratory, now the way people are going to show they're smart and sophisticated is not by being skeptical or even cynical. It's by finding a way that you can accomplish the thing that everyone thinks it's impossible to do. So that little flip is really the heart of GVV. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, what if you were this person? They know what they think is right. How could they get it done effectively?
Right. And I think it's really interesting to think that way, because it also parallels a shift, I think, in the ethics and compliance community, where over the years, one of the first ways, and many times it's like the sheriff or the Department of No, is like, here are the rules. Here is what you need to do. Here is what, if you don't do it this way, you can't do it, which becomes a problem, because there are different considerations with business, and it isn't even putting into account, is somebody trying to do the right thing? Have they figured out, are they thinking about it? What are they actually asking, as opposed to asking about a regulation? They're asking for advice on how to make the best decision. So I think that the parallel of this is really, I think, very relevant to what we all are trying to do, many of us, on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important point, Lisa. When I work with companies as opposed to academic settings, quite often I'll end up working, in addition to working with the executives, the management, and the employees themselves, I'll be collaborating with the ethics and compliance officers. And one of the nice things about the GVV approach is that it actually gives ethics officers and compliance officers another role. So instead of being only the police, so to speak, or the sheriff, as you put it, you actually get to be a coach and an advisor and a helper. I remember the first company to utilize GVV has been, and they still use it, is Lockheed Martin. And I remember talking to some of their ethics and compliance team a number of years ago, and they were saying what's interesting is that when people come to them with ethics issues after they've gone through some of this ethics training, some of this GVV training, they'll often come and say, look, there's something going on. I want to deal with it. But will you work with me to figure out an effective way to stop this behavior before it crosses the line, before it becomes something that needs to be mandatorily reported, because I think we're going down the wrong path. And that really enriches the role of the ethics and compliance officer. It gives them an opportunity to really play a significant leadership development kind of role. And so I think that's one of the exciting things about it, so instead of it just being about reporting and hotlines, which of course are important, but, we're trying to, what GVV is often about is trying to expand the conversation that you're having within the organization so that you don't go down that path that then requires, an investigation and reporting and all kinds of other negative consequences.
And I'm going to say one other thing, and I wanted to let the listeners know this is going to be two parts because I think we want to focus a bit more about some of the organizational items, and that will be our part 2. But one other thing I wanted to mention to close out this part is to talk about what I really like too, and it was the quote that I saw in a lot of your different materials, which, by the way, anyone listening are fantastic. And it's the question of what if I were going to act on my value? What would I say and do, and how could I be most effective? I feel like those points are so helpful in the both. It's oversimplifying a lot that you do, but it also is a way that the business and people that you're working with every day who aren't thinking about ethics and compliance all the time can kind of take that 3-part, those 3 questions and really boil down what they're doing to be able to bring it to the ethics and compliance professionals to help them work and move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Those questions, I think, crystallize a lot of what I hope the impact of GVV will be on people who experience it. I would say, look, these it's not easy to do this. And it's not even always going to work, but it's important. And we can get better at it. And so a lot of what GVV is about is helping people understand that actually you often have more choices than you think. And you don't allow yourself to see the choice unless you begin to ask those questions that you were just naming, those kinds of what if questions. And that also is building on recent research that suggests that, the way people confront values conflicts is not to sit down and make a pro and con list or to ask, what would John Rawls say? Usually what happens is we have this experience and you react sort of immediately, automatically, even emotionally. And then we rationalize post hoc why it was the right thing to do or the only thing we could do, that we didn't have a choice. And so what GVV is about is actually trying to rewire that automatic connection. And you don't do that simply through analysis. To rewire that automatic emotionally based response in terms of understanding or believing you have choices, the way you rewire that is through building a habit, building practice, practicing responding to the kinds of objections you might encounter, and doing that pre-scripting and rehearsal and peer coaching with peers who would be the very kinds of people you would need to talk to in the actual circumstances. So I often tell people what this is really about is just changing the conversation within the organization.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful to change that conversation. And also from a tone perspective, it is a tone of we respect you and we think you have good judgment. as opposed to here's what's the worst thing that could happen and let's review this for a while and talk about it, as you were saying earlier. Let's come up with, as I think about it, as a law school exam. Now, we're going to pause, and I want to say thank you for part one of this interview. And listeners, we have more next week that's going to come up, and we're going to talk about some of the direct impacts in organizations. And thank you so much, and really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.